Magnus Carlsen and Wesley face off in an intense game. The game begins with Magnus playing e4 and Wesley responding with the solid e5, knight to f3 and knight to f6, entering the Petrov defense, a classic choice for counter-attacking the center. Knight takes the pawn, and knight takes the pawn. Now Magnus plays the queen to e2, aiming to maintain pressure, and Wesley calmly develops his queen to e7 to keep things balanced. Magnus captures the knight, while Wesley pushes his pawn to d6, targeting the strong knight on e5. Pawn to d4, and pawn captures the knight on e5, and Magnus swiftly recaptures with his pawn. Wesley develops his knight to c6, adding pressure to the center, and Magnus brings his knight to c3 for a further development. Wesley, staying aggressive, captures the pawn on e5 with his queen, but Magnus isn't backing down. He captures the queen on e5 with check, and Wesley captures the queen with the knight. Now Magnus develops his bishop to f4, eyeing key squares, while Wesley pushes his pawn to f6, preparing to support his center. Magnus long castles, bringing his rook into action, and Wesley develops his bishop to d7, staying solid. Here comes a sneaky move. Magnus secretly jumps his knight to b5, threatening a fork on c7. But Wesley spots the threat and castles queenside, avoiding trouble. Undeterred, Magnus grabs the pawn on a7 with his knight. Wesley moves his king to b8. Magnus retreats his knight to b5, preparing for the next phase, while Wesley develops his bishop to c5. Magnus pushes the pawn to f3, and Wesley strikes with g5. Magnus captures the knight on e5, but Wesley immediately recaptures with the pawn, keeping the game dynamic. Magnus repositions his knight to c3, targeting key squares, while Wesley pushes his pawn to g4, initiating an attack. Magnus captures the pawn on g4, and Wesley delivers a check with his bishop on e3. Magnus calmly steps his king to b1, ensuring safety, and Wesley moves the bishop to c6, eyeing critical diagonals. And here comes a decisive move. Magnus captures the rook on d8 with check. Wesley has no choice but to recapture with his rook. Magnus develops his bishop to d3, consolidating his pieces, but Wesley counters by capturing the pawn on g2 with his bishop. Magnus calmly moves his rook to e1, ready to challenge Wesley's position, and Wesley develops his bishop to f4, bringing it into the fight. Magnus pushes the pawn to h4, and Wesley reinforces his pawn structure by pushing to h6. Not slowing down, Magnus moves his rook to g1, creating pressure, and Wesley develops his bishop to f3. Here's where the game takes an exciting turn. Magnus moves his pawn to g5, and Wesley responds by capturing the pawn on g5. Magnus recaptures, and Wesley moves pawn to e4. But Magnus isn't done. He captures the pawn on e4, and Wesley immediately recaptures with his bishop. Magnus simplifies the position by taking the bishop on e4 with his knight, and Wesley moves his bishop to e3, keeping his pieces active. Magnus develops his rook to f1, and Wesley moves his rook to e8, ensuring defensive coordination. Now Magnus plays a great move. He moves his pawn to g6. This pawn becomes a game changer as Wesley cannot afford to capture the knight on e4. The pawn would advance to promotion, spelling disaster for Wesley. Instead, Wesley develops his bishop to h6, trying to defend. Magnus repositions his knight to c5, eyeing opportunities, while Wesley moves his rook to g8, hoping to block the pawn's advance. Magnus then moves the rook to g1, protecting the pawn, and Wesley moves his king to c8. Magnus shifts his rook to g4, creating tactical threats, while Wesley pushes his pawn to b6. But Magnus calmly retreats his knight to e4, setting up a new attack, and Wesley develops his bishop to g7. Magnus then plays c3, solidifying his pawn structure as Wesley moves his king to d7. Magnus now brings his knight to g3, setting up further threats, and Wesley moves his rook to h8. Magnus doesn't let up. He moves the knight to f5, and Wesley retreats his bishop to fe6. But then it leads to Magnus pushing the pawn to g7, one step away from promotion and becoming a queen, and Wesley moves his rook again to g8, trying to hold the line. Magnus now plays the decisive move, rook to e4, and with that, Wesley resigns the game. But why? If Wesley captures the pawn on g7 with his bishop, Magnus would simply move his rook to e7, winning the material and gaining a decisive advantage.